When you picture the bustling medieval cities of Europe, London, Paris, Florence, you may imagine stone streets, market squares, or looming cathedrals. But beneath these romantic visions, a dirtier, more skittering truth reigned supreme. These cities were the domain of rats, and no one really seemed to mind. In this first section, we explore how the urban design, living conditions, and human habits of medieval times created the perfect world for rodents. While humans ruled in name, it was the rats who had the run of the place. It began with the streets. Medieval cities were not built with rats in mind, or perhaps, in a way, they were. Cobblestone roads were loosely fitted, with gaps wide enough for small animals to crawl through. Beneath these stones lay a network of decaying organic matter, food scraps, manure, spilled beer, and human waste. There were no underground sewers in most cities until the 18th century. What flowed beneath the city flowed freely. Houses were tightly packed together, constructed of wood and wattle and daub. There were no basements, just cool, damp earth beneath floorboards. Walls were full of holes. Roofs were thatched. Every crack was a door, every corner a nest. Even the grandest castles, with their thick stone walls, had vermin. Rats followed food, and food was everywhere. Medieval urban life was a feast for rodents. Most people lived in a state of permanent food insecurity. Yet, paradoxically, waste was common. The rich discarded food in large quantities. Even the poor, though frugal, couldn't preserve perishables for long. There were no refrigerators. Cheese hardened, bread molded, meats turned sour. Rats, with their ever-growing teeth, weren't picky. Rancid fat? Perfect. A bucket of discarded oats? Delicious. Even better, medieval people threw their trash out of windows. Streets were open garbage dumps, especially in poorer districts. The term middens refer to piles of refuse that might sit for weeks before being cleared, if they ever were. Rats burrowed, bred, and bloated on these heaps. Let's talk toilets. Most homes had none. Chamber pots, ceramic bowls used for nighttime relief, were common, but their contents were flung out of windows or doors with little warning. A cry of "Gardes low! Watch out for the water!" was supposed to alert passers-by, but accidents were common. Some houses were built with overhanging upper floors, so people could relieve themselves directly into the street below. Others had cesspits, holes in the ground covered with planks. These were rarely cleaned. It's worth noting that this was not due to ignorance. Medieval people knew bad smells were unhealthy. They just didn't understand why. Miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, dominated thought. And it so happened that the same bad air where disease thrived was also where rats did. You might wonder, didn't people try to kill the rats? Yes and no. Cats were kept in homes, and dogs roamed the streets. But both were sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially cats, which were associated with witchcraft in certain periods. Poison existed, but was expensive and dangerous to humans as well. Traps were crude and inefficient. Mostly, people accepted rats as a nuisance, like rain or taxes. In some texts, rats were even admired for their cleverness. Their ability to find food, escape danger, and reproduce rapidly earned them grudging respect. One 14th century monk wrote in his journal about watching a rat steal bread from a novice monk's plate. It was clever and quick. It had no fear of man. The monk didn't scold the rat. He admired it. Imagine falling asleep on a straw mattress in a timber house. The mattress is crawling with fleas. There's no glass in your window, only shutters. Your room is dark, but from the eaves and corners, you hear the quiet gnawing of teeth. A tail brushes your cheek. Rats were not just in walls. They slept beside humans, under their beds, or in their piles of clothes. They chewed through boots, nested in hay, and bit when disturbed. Diseases spread not because rats were aggressive, but because their fleas were. The Black Death, the plague that killed between 75 and 200 million people, was spread by the fleas that lived on black rats. These fleas, desperate for food, bit humans when rats died. But here's the chilling detail. No one connected rats with disease for centuries. People blamed bad air, sin, and divine punishment. The rats? They were just there. Believe it or not, rats were sometimes brought to trial. In certain parts of medieval Europe, particularly France, it was not unheard of for communities to put animals on legal trial. Pigs were the most common defendants, often executed for injuring humans. But in one 16th century case, rats were summoned to court. A lawyer named Bartholomew Chassani defended them. When the rats failed to appear, Chassani argued they were not disobeying the summons, but merely afraid to travel the roads, since cats and dogs posed dangers along the way. The judge, unable to ensure their safe passage, adjourned the case. It was not a joke. These were serious proceedings. Rats, to the medieval mind, were not a metaphor. They were citizens, troublesome, yes, but part of the living order. As strange as it sounds, putting them on trial fit with the worldview of the time. Everything had a place, even vermin. So the question isn't really, why did rats rule the streets of medieval cities? The question is, how could they not? Every element of urban life, housing, food, waste, sanitation, law, enabled their reign. The average city dweller lived elbow to elbow with vermin and barely gave a second thought. But what happened when the rats weren't just nuisances, but harbingers of something darker? What happened when the plague came? The 14th century was a time of strange omens. Crops failed. Storms destroyed harvests. People whispered of stars falling, of God's wrath, of demons walking in daylight. But none of it prepared Europe for what arrived in 1347 aboard ships from the Black Sea. A plague. It moved invisibly, but it traveled in fleas. Fleas that lived on rats. Rats that had lived among humans for centuries without causing mass suspicion. By the time people noticed the sickness spreading, it was far too late. This section follows the early stages of the Black Death's arrival in Europe and how rats, and the social structures that enabled them, played a critical, if still misunderstood, role in its deadly spread. It started in October in the port city of Messina, Sicily. A Genoese trading vessel arrived from the Crimea. The sailors aboard were either dead or dying. Tumors the size of eggs festered in their armpits and groins. Their breath was shallow, their skin blackened. The authorities quickly expelled the ship, but rats can swim, and the fleas needed new hosts. From Sicily, the disease spread like wildfire. In just months, it was in Marseille, Barcelona, and Genoa. By the next year, it had reached Paris and London. But no one blamed the rats. To the medieval mind, illness was not spread by animals, but by sin and air. Miasma theory, as mentioned earlier, held that bad air carried disease. This was not entirely wrong. Many diseases do spread to the air, but it misdirected preventive measures. People carried aromatic herbs to sweeten the air. Some even fled to the countryside, thinking the fresh air would save them. It didn't. Rats didn't just roam streets. They nested in haylofts, bread ovens, pantries, and the corners of textile workshops. As cloth and wool moved across Europe, so did rats and their fleas. Merchant caravans and pilgrims inadvertently transported infested goods. A boat of cloth shipped from Bruges to Florence might carry 100 fleas, hidden in the folds. Rats, hiding in sacks of grain or barrels of dried fish, would leap free upon arrival. Interestingly, rat infestations often followed trade routes, echoing the very paths along which the plague advanced. And still, the rats themselves were not the story. As the Black Death devoured population centers, society began to unravel. Grave diggers died faster than they could bury others. Churches rang funeral bells until there were no clergy left to ring them. Entire families vanished behind locked doors. In Siena, a chronicler wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. None could be found to bury the dead." But in this collapse, rats thrived. Fewer people meant less oversight, more abandoned food, more quiet spaces for nesting. Buildings became silent mausoleums. Markets emptied, but the rats remained, chewing, breeding, and carrying the fleas to the next village. One might say that during the plague, rats ruled even more completely. Strangely, rats are largely absent from plague records. Wills, court logs, death registries, and letters describe symptoms in haunting detail: carbuncles, blackened limbs, spitting of blood. But the role of vermin went unnoticed. Scholars debate the silence. Was it ignorance, or simply a sense that rats were normal? There is one curious exception. In 1361, a French physician named Jean de Venette mentioned rats dying in large numbers before outbreaks. He noted that household vermin perish before children began coughing blood. He made no connection. And so, while doctors carried bird-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, rats carried fleas to the next house. And no one stopped them. Instead of rats, people blamed the stars. Some believe an astrological alignment in March 1345 caused corrupted air. The poor, beggars and lepers were targeted, accused of spreading illness. The Jewish population. In one of Europe's most tragic responses, thousands of Jews were massacred, burned alive, or expelled under suspicion of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg, 1349, over 2,000 Jews were burned to death in a single day. The scapegoating not only failed to stop the plague, it ignored the true carriers entirely. The rats went unnoticed, scurrying through chaos as humans turn on one another. Rats are survivors. They thrive in scarcity, adapt to threats, and use human environments better than humans do. During the plague years, their population dipped only when food was severely limited or when entire cities were abandoned, but they always rebounded. In cities like Venice and Avignon, where rat populations were naturally smaller, often due to architectural quirks, the plague had slightly less impact, but this was not understood at the time. What humans couldn't see or chose not to see was that the creature they most ignored had become a central figure in the greatest pandemic of the age. Today, we know that the real killer wasn't a rat, but the flea. Xenocilla chaopes, the oriental rat flea, carries Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. When its rat host dies, it bites humans. One flea can infect dozens of people. The flea doesn't discriminate. It goes where the blood is. Still, without rats, fleas would never have reached European cities in the first place. Rats were the vehicle, the housing complex, the delivery system, and for centuries, no one even noticed. The 14th century plague reshaped Europe. It killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent's population. Yet, in all the fear, the grief, the desperation, no one blamed the rat. They had lived alongside humans so long. They were practically furniture. Their role in one of history's worst disasters was invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was ordinary. But what happened after plague? Did anything change? Were rats finally seen for what they were? By the time the worst of the Black Death had passed in the early 1350s, Europe was no longer the same. Entire towns had vanished. Fields lay fallow. The social order was fractured. Yet, through all this upheaval, one thing remained remarkably unchanged. Rats. This final section explores how rats continue to coexist with humans in the centuries after plague, how they slowly emerge from the shadows of historical obscurity, and how, despite everything, they still outlive kingdoms, empires, and dynasties. Their rule never ended. It simply adapted. In the years following the plague, cities rebuilt. The labor shortage gave surviving workers new leverage. Serfs demanded wages. Guilds loosened rules. Some say the seeds of capitalism were planted in plague soil. But infrastructure? That changed slowly. Streets were repaved, often over the same old waste channels. Houses were rebuilt, still with open foundations, thatched roofs, and wooden beams. People were still throwing waste into the street. Cesspits remained. Public sanitation, where it existed at all, focused on odors, not hygiene. In short, rats still had everything they needed. They were the silent beneficiaries of the plague's aftermath, inheriting cities emptied of people and full of food. It would take over 300 years before the role of rats in the plague was scientifically understood. Even during subsequent outbreaks, such as the Great Plague of London in 1665, people clung to the miasma theory. In fact, efforts to cleanse the air often involved lighting large fires in the streets or killing cats, which ironically allowed rat populations to surge. Doctors wore leather suits and stuffed their beaked masks with lavender, believing scent would protect them. These suits offered little to no protection from fleas. And all the while, rats scurried in and out of plague houses, stables, and cellars. They had become part of the background noise of urban life. A flick of the tail in a gutter, a rustle in the rafters, Unremarkable, expected. By the 16th and 17th centuries, some cities began to take sanitation more seriously. Public latrines were built in Paris and London. Waste carts ran regular routes in Amsterdam. In 1572, the city of Norwich required all filth and ordure to be carried away weekly, but implementation was patchy. Private homes rarely complied. Laws were ignored or inconsistently enforced. And rats, ever adaptable, move with the times. They found new food sources in bakeries, taverns, and marketplaces. They bred in the attics of printing shops and burrowed into barrels in merchant docks. Traps became more common and poison improved. But extermination was never the goal. It was population control, at best. No one thought rats could be eradicated. And they were right. Around the 18th century, a new player entered the scene. The brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, also known as a Norway rat. Larger, more aggressive, and better suited to colder climates, the brown rat began displacing the black rat, Rattus rattus, throughout Europe. Historians believe it arrived via Russian grain ships, spreading westward. By 1800, it dominated most of Western Europe and was a regular stowaway in ships bound for the Americas. This shift had complex consequences. The black rat had been the primary vector in earlier plague outbreaks. As brown rats became more common and less flea-infested, plague cases declined. But again, this wasn't understood at the time. It was an accident of evolution, not human intervention. One rat species replaced another, and the reign continued. It wasn't until 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, that a French doctor, Alexander Yersin, isolated the bacterium Yersinia pestis from a plague victim. Shortly after, fleas were identified as the vector. Rats were finally implicated, 5.5 centuries after the Black Death. Even then, the connection met resistance. People were reluctant to believe that such a lowly creature had caused such devastation. It felt too simple, too unglamorous. But by the early 20th century, the evidence was undeniable. Rats were placed at the center of public health efforts. Governments launched extermination campaigns. Quarantine protocols included rat inspections. Ships were required to carry deratting certificates before docking. Rats, once ignored, had become villains of public health. Yes and no. Today, cities have sewers, sanitation departments, and building codes. Garbage is collected. Water is treated. Public health surveillance is real. But rats? Still here. They adapt to concrete, to steel, to poison, to traps. They follow us through subway tunnels, scale skyscrapers, and feast in dumpsters. New York, London, Mumbai, Tokyo. Rats outnumber humans in many major cities. Their success is not in spite of us, but because of us. Our food, our waste, our warmth. They feed the empire of rats. And yet, most of us still don't see them. Not really. In a strange way, rats are historical mirrors. They reflect how we live, our messes, our excesses, our failures in planning. They remind us that every great civilization, from Rome to Paris to New York, leaves a trail of crumbs. And someone always follows the crumbs. We build cities. They build under cities. We wage wars. They wait in the rubble. We celebrate progress. They celebrate our garbage. Rats are survivors. They've endured floods, fire, war, plague, and poison. No king ever ruled as long. No general was ever as consistent. No pope has lasted as many centuries. They don't write history, but they've lived through every chapter of it. So, why did rats rule the streets of medieval cities? Because they were made for it. And because we made it easy. And, in a way, maybe they still do. After all this time, after so many attempts to rid ourselves of them, they remain lurking, chewing, scurrying, watching our rise and fall from the shadows. The question now isn't why they ruled then. It's, will they ever stop? Concrete. It's everywhere around you. Sidewalks, bridges, buildings, dams. But have you ever stopped to wonder, how did humanity first figure out how to make rocks out of dust and water? And why did it take us until the 20th century to build concrete that lasts, when the Romans had already done it over 2,000 years ago? In this first section, we explore the quiet marvel of Roman concrete, why it was so resilient, how it helped build an empire, and why its secret was forgotten for centuries. In the ancient world, most buildings were made from natural stone, mud brick, or timber. The Greeks built with marble and limestone, carving massive blocks with precision. The Egyptians used mud brick for homes and colossal stone for temples. But these materials had limits. Stone was heavy and difficult to move. It needed skilled labor and time. Timber was prone to rot and fire. Mud brick eroded easily in the rain. Concrete, on the other hand, was a revolutionary idea, a liquid that could become rock. It could be poured, molded, and shaped, allowing architects to imagine structures that would have been impossible with cut stone. But it didn't start with Rome. The earliest versions of concrete-like materials date back to the Mycenaeans in the 2nd millennium BCE. They used lime and pebble for flooring. The Egyptians mixed gypsum mortar, but it was the Romans who perfected the formula. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman builders had developed what we now call opus caementitium, a mixture of lime, calcium oxide, volcanic ash, pozzolana, water, and aggregate like stone or tile fragments. And with it, they changed the world. Roman concrete made architecture mobile. Temples no longer had to be carved from mountains. They could be poured on site. The Pantheon in Rome, still standing after nearly 2,000 years, has the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. It was poured in layers, each using a slightly different mix of materials. Aqueducts, stretching for miles across valleys, were lined with concrete. Harbors, once impossible to construct in the open sea, were built with concrete that hardened underwater, a feat modern engineers still find impressive. The Portus Cosenus, a Roman harbor, contains underwater breakwaters made from concrete that remain stable to this day. Why? Because Roman engineers had stumbled on something modern chemistry only recently began to understand. The key ingredient was volcanic ash, known as pozzolana, named after the town of Pozzuoli near Naples. When mixed with lime and water, it created a chemical reaction that produced a strong, durable binder. This reaction was known as a pozzolanic reaction, essentially a natural cement. What made pozzolana special was that it allowed the concrete to set underwater. Traditional lime mortars dissolved, but this mixture got stronger. In fact, Roman marine concrete continues to grow stronger over time, unlike modern concrete, which deteriorates. We now know that the volcanic ash reacts with seawater and forms rare minerals like aluminum tobamorite, which give the structure incredible durability. But of course, the Romans didn't know that. They just knew it worked. Much of what we know about Roman concrete comes from Vitruvius, a Roman architect and engineer who lived in the 1st century BCE. His 10-volume work, De Architectura, described the types of materials used in construction and their properties. Vitruvius insisted that the best volcanic ash came from areas nearby in Mount Vesuvius and warned against inferior ashes from other regions. He also provided ratios of lime to pozzolana and instructions for when to use different aggregates. Yet, despite these records, later generations lost the art. By the fall of the Roman Empire, the secrets of Roman concrete were fading. Medieval builders returned to stone and lime mortars. The formula, it seemed, had vanished into the ruins. Why was something so effective lost? The answer is both simple and tragic. Infrastructure doesn't preserve its own blueprints. After Rome's fall, centralized engineering collapsed. Roads, aqueducts, and buildings remained, but the guilds and knowledge networks that maintained them disintegrated. Roman engineering became mystery. Churches and castles rose again in stone, but few asked how the Romans had poured domes and built seawalls. The few who did, like monastic scribes or curious architects, often misinterpreted what they saw. Concrete became Roman stone. The ash was mistaken for sand. The methods disappeared from collective memory. It wouldn't be until the 18th century that interest in Roman concrete returned in earnest, and not until the 21st century that science began to explain its resilience. The Roman Empire poured millions of tons of concrete across 3 continents. Their recipe was simple, effective, and sustainable. So why did we stop using it? Why did we replace it with weaker materials, ones that crack, erode, and crumble in mere decades? And more importantly, can we still learn from it? The monuments of ancient Rome are still with us, not just as crumbling ruins, but as silent, enduring testaments to an empire that mastered the chemistry of earth, fire, and water. In this section, we delve deeper into why Roman concrete has lasted so long, how it interacts with nature rather than resisting it, and how modern science slowly pieced together the secrets locked in the stones. Modern concrete, despite its central role in our cities, has a glaring flaw. It cracks. Once water enters those cracks, it corrodes the steel reinforcements inside, weakens the structure, and starts a slow death spiral. Even reinforced concrete has a lifespan of 50 to 100 years at best. Roman concrete? It heals itself. In the early 21st century, scientists began investigating core samples from Roman harbors, especially the Portus Cosenus in Tuscany and the Portus Julius in the Bay of Naples. What they found was remarkable. Microscopic analysis showed that Roman concrete contained lime clasts, small chunks of lime that, when exposed to water over centuries, reactivated and filled in cracks. This wasn't a flaw. It was by design. The lime, instead of being fully mixed, remained in hot pockets within the concrete matrix. When water seeped in, the lime dissolved slightly, recrystallized, and patched the breach, forming new calcium-based minerals like calcite. It was, in essence, a self-healing material. The Romans didn't have a name for this phenomenon. They didn't need one. They just knew their structures endured. Most modern structures fear the sea. Salt water corrodes rebar and eats away at concrete. Coastal piers and sea walls must be repaired or replaced every few decades. Roman harbor concrete, however, becomes stronger in seawater. Why? The interaction between seawater, volcanic ash, and lime triggers a long-term crystallization process that creates minerals like philipsite and aluminum tobermarite, both of which are rare and incredibly stable. Instead of fighting the environment, Roman concrete cooperated with it. It's a principle that modern engineering often forgets. Sometimes, nature is not the enemy, it's a partner. Not all volcanic ash is created equal. Roman engineers knew this intuitively. The best ash came from regions near Mount Vesuvius, rich in silica and alumina, with the right grain size to encourage pozzolanic reactions. Ash from elsewhere lacked the proper chemical balance. Modern scientists, using scanning electron microscopes and X-ray diffraction, confirmed what Roman builders already knew: geology matters. The strength and durability of Roman concrete came not just from the formula, but from the exact composition of the local materials. In a way, Roman concrete wasn't a single recipe. It was a practice, a method of choosing and combining Earth's ingredients based on local knowledge. Even though Vitruvius and later Roman authors wrote about construction materials, their instructions were vague by modern standards. Words like cimenta, opus incertum, or rudis were used interchangeably. Proportions were approximate. Instructions relied on experience, not exact science. As a result, later generations misinterpreted the process. During the Renaissance, architects like Palladio admired Roman ruins but misunderstood their materials. They focused on form and style, columns, domes, proportions, rather than the underlying chemistry. Concrete, to them, was an afterthought. The rediscovery of hydraulic lime mortars in the 18th century helped revive interest in ancient techniques, but the true pozzolanic formula wasn't replicated until the 20th and 21st centuries, when geology, chemistry, and materials science converged. The secret had always been there, in plain stone, but it took centuries to recognize it. In 2017, a team of researchers led by Marie Jackson at the University of Utah published findings that explain how seawater interacted with Roman marine concrete over millennia. Her team found that the volcanic ash used by the Romans was full of zeolites, minerals with a sponge-like structure that captured ions from seawater. These ions helped form long-lasting crystals, reinforcing the concrete. The takeaway was stunning. Roman concrete is the most durable building material in human history, and we've only just begun to understand why. Modern engineers began to ask, could we use these insights today? Could future cities be built not with fast-setting, high-carbon concrete, but with longer-lasting, self-healing, low-emission concrete inspired by Rome? There's another reason Roman concrete deserves attention. It's environmentally friendly. Modern Portland cement production is responsible for nearly 8% of global CO2 emissions. It requires heating limestone to 1,450 degrees Celsius, releasing vast amounts of carbon. Roman concrete, by contrast, used less lime, mixed it at lower temperatures, and relied on naturally reactive ash rather than artificial additives. It wasn't just stronger, it was cleaner. In the era of climate crisis, the concrete of the past may offer a roadmap to the sustainable materials of the future. But are we listening? Roman engineers didn't leave behind a formula. They left ruins. And those ruins, it turns out, contain more knowledge than the books that survived them. In the cracks of harbor walls, in the layers of domes, in the dusty pores of marine pillars, they left a message, not in ink, but in rock. Build with nature, not against it. But now that we've rediscovered their secret, will we remember it? Or will we forget again? If you've ever walked beneath the oculus of the Pantheon, stood beside the fractured sea walls of ancient Roman ports, or traced your fingers across the sun-baked ruins of a crumbling aqueduct, you experienced something quietly profound. Time passed, and the concrete held. In this final section, we explore how modern builders are finally taking Roman concrete seriously, how it might change the future of construction, and why the past often holds solutions to problems we've only just begun to face. Let's return for a moment to the Pantheon in Rome. Constructed around 126 CE under Emperor Hadrian, its dome still holds the title of largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It has survived fires, earthquakes, invasions, and centuries of neglect. The concrete doesn't just persist, it ages well. Why? Because Roman builders understood their materials. The base of the dome is made from heavier aggregate, travertine. The upper dome uses lighter pumice. The thickness of the dome tapers elegantly from the base to the oculus, reducing pressure. And the lime pozzolana mix was carefully adjusted at each level. This wasn't primitive guesswork. It was engineering mastery. Now consider the Sydney Opera House, completed in 1973, or Boston's Big Dig, finished in the early 2000s. Both use modern reinforced concrete, and both have already required extensive repairs. Modern concrete relies on steel reinforcement, which rusts and expands over time, cracking the concrete from within. It's strong at first, but vulnerable long-term. Water, salt, freeze-thaw cycles all eat away at its strength. Despite our scientific advancements, we build for decades. The Romans built for centuries. Today, teams of geologists, chemists, and materials engineers are revisiting the Roman formula. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, researchers have recreated Roman-style concrete using pozzolanic ash and quicklime, discovering its self-healing abilities. In Switzerland, researchers are exploring low-carbon concrete based on Roman mixtures to meet climate targets. The U.S. Department of Energy has funded studies into using volcanic ash from the western United States to replicate the durability of Roman marine structures. And in Rome itself, architects are working to restore ancient sites using similar materials, honoring the wisdom of the builders who came before. What was once lost to history is now fueling the future of construction. It's tempting to wonder, what if Roman concrete had never been lost? Imagine the cathedrals of medieval Europe built with self-healing mortar. Imagine 18th century bridges lasting thousands of years instead of crumbling in decades. Imagine entire cities constructed with materials that strengthen over time. Instead, we spent centuries relearning what was already known, embedded in ruins but unrecognized. This is a quiet tragedy of history. Not just what we forget, but how long it takes to remember. Our world today is built on concrete. It's the second most used substance on Earth after water, but it comes at a cost. Billions of tons of carbon emissions, crumbling infrastructure, enormous maintenance bills. If Roman concrete had been the standard, we might have avoided much of this. Not just stronger buildings, but less waste, less pollution, less decay. Instead, our cities are full of planned obsolescence, where materials fail faster than they should. We call it progress, but sometimes it's simply reinventing the wheel badly. Roman concrete teaches us something humbling. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast. It didn't require steel or polymers or industrial furnaces. It was made from lime, ash, stone, and knowledge, combined with patience and care. It wasn't the tools that made it great. It was the mindset. Build to last. Work with nature. Use what the earth gives you wisely. These ideas are easy to forget in an age of speed and efficiency, but Rome whispers them still from every wall that still stands. Roman concrete endures not because it was stronger, but because it was smarter. It didn't resist the world. It became part of it. It didn't fear water. It welcomed it. It didn't hide time. It embraced it. As we face the challenges of a warming planet, aging infrastructure, and cities expanding faster than we can maintain them, perhaps it's time to ask a different kind of question. Not, how fast can we build it? But, will it still stand in 1,000 years? You hold a sheet of paper in your hand, a grocery list, a printed memo, a discarded receipt. You crumple it without thought, maybe toss it into the trash. But this humble object has a history of revolutions behind it. Before the digital age, before printing presses, before even parchment, paper was the silent engine behind administration, religion, warfare, and empire. In this first section, we examine the world before paper, how information was stored, how power was managed through writing, and how the eventual spread of paper would quietly undermine the foundations of the old world. Long before paper, humans found other ways to record knowledge. Clay tablets in Sumer, as early as 3000 BC, using wedge-shaped cuneiform. Papyrus scrolls in Egypt, made from the reeds of the Nile Delta. Animal skins, parchment and vellum, used throughout the classical world. Silk scrolls in ancient China, expensive and limited to elite circles. Wax tablets in Rome, erasable and reusable. These media were fragile, heavy, costly, or time-consuming. Writing was not casual. It was deliberate. Every line cost labor. Every scroll required a scribe. And so, information flowed slowly and often in service of the state or the gods. The average person? Illiterate, uninformed, unrecorded. Enter the scribe. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Rome, scribes held unique positions of power. They were literate in a world of silence. They copied laws, tax records, edicts, and sacred texts. In doing so, they became essential not just to governance but to continuity. In ancient Egypt, scribes were exempt from labor and military service. In China, Confucian scholars passed written exams to serve in imperial courts. In the Islamic Golden Age, scribes compiled hadiths and translated Greek texts into Arabic. Their tools? Reed pens, ink made from soot, scrolls or skins. Their job was not to create, but to preserve. And without paper, their work was slow. Monks in medieval scriptoria might take an entire year to copy a single book. So when paper finally arrived, it was not a ripple. It was a quiet tsunami. Paper was invented in Han Dynasty China, traditionally attributed to a court official named Kai Luan in 105 CE. He developed a method of pulping mulberry bark, rags, hemp, and fishnets to produce a thin, flat writing surface. Unlike bamboo strips or silk, it was cheaper to produce, easier to carry and store, capable of holding ink without smudging. The Chinese government quickly saw its utility, not for art or books, but for bureaucracy, tax rolls, census data, military orders. The machinery of empire ran faster with paper in its gears. Paper's rise was bureaucratic before it was cultural. That pattern would repeat. For centuries, paper remained a Chinese state secret, but through trade and conquest, it began to move. By the 7th century, paper had spread to Korea and Japan. By the 8th century, it reached Samarkand, a key Silk Road city, after the Chinese lost a battle to Arab forces and captured papermakers. From there, paper entered the Islamic world, where it flourished. In Baghdad, paper workshops sprung up along the Tigris. The Abbasid Caliphate used it to record administrative records, legal opinions, medical treatises, poetry, and theology. The Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, preserved and translated Greek knowledge on paper. By 1100 CE, paper had become the information infrastructure of the Islamic Empire. Europe, still using parchment, still copying by candlelight. But change was coming. Early Europe resisted paper. Why? Monastic scribes mistrusted its durability. Parchment was thicker, stronger, more holy. Guilds controlling parchment production feared economic loss. The church saw paper as foreign, Muslim, Eastern, suspicious. Even as paper mills appeared in Spain and Sicily, brought by Islamic influence, adoption was slow. And yet, merchants and secular officials began using it anyway, because it was cheap. Ledgers, contracts, shipping manifests. Suddenly, more people could write. More documents could be kept. The world began to shift, not through a single event, but through the gradual soft rustle of turning pages. As paper spread, something subtle changed in human behavior. We stopped relying solely on memory and oral tradition. We began to write things down, not just important events, but mundane ones. Grain deliveries, marriage licenses, debts owed, witness statements. Paper became the medium of the bureaucratic mind, and one's records could be stored, retrieved, and compared. Institutions grew stronger. States became more efficient. Taxes became more precise. Disputes could be settled with documents, not duels. Power began to shift, not from sword to pen, but from voice to paper. In this prelude to paper's Western Revolution, one question rises. What happens when the ability to read and write, once held by priests and scribes, begins to spread to merchants, traders, students, and even peasants? What happens when information becomes cheaper than silence? The answer lies in the coming centuries, and it starts with a single, copied page. As paper began to seep into European cities, towns, and villages, it didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no parade, no proclamation, no thunderclap. But like water through stone, it wore down centuries-old barriers between ruler and subject, priest and parishioner, rich and poor. In this section, we'll follow paper's subtle conquest of Europe, from bureaucratic adoption to the invention of the printing press. From the desk of a Florentine merchant to the rebel monk Martin Luther, paper reshaped the rules, quietly, irreversibly. By the 13th century, paper mills dotted Italy and southern France. Muslim Spain had already been producing it for decades. Trade routes, especially those passing through Venice, Genoa, and Florence, were fertile ground for paper spread. Merchants were the first Europeans to truly embrace paper. Why? Because commerce runs on records. Letters of credit, bills of lading, receipts, shipping manifests, legal contracts. Unlike parchment, paper was affordable enough to use for temporary documentation. This affordability, ironically, is what made it permanent. Once trade depended on it, governments followed. In cities like Florence, entire civic administrations began running on ledgers and folios. Taxation, citizenship, zoning. Paper gave rise to the paper state. By the 14th century, paper had moved from merchant docks to royal courts. The English exchequer used paper for financial records. The French monarchy issued paper decrees and royal accounts. The papacy adopted paper for internal communication and registry management. Once governments began operating on paper, they became different governments, more organized, more systematic, more archival. Paper enabled record keeping on a scale never before possible. But it also did something else, something unintended. It made records replicable. And that would soon lead to a revolution no king could stop. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable metal type to Europe. While printing itself wasn't new, it had existed in China and Korea. Gutenberg's innovation was combining it with Europe's increasingly available paper supply. The first major product? The Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455. But printing didn't stop at holy texts. Within decades, presses across Europe were printing pamphlets, sermons, satirical cartoons, legal tracts, political arguments, and all of it on paper. This is the point where paper ceased to be simply a tool for officials and merchants. It became a weapon, a voice, a virus. For over 1,000 years, scribes have been the gatekeepers of knowledge. They controlled copying. They filtered what was worth preserving. They worked under the patronage of kings, bishops, and monasteries. Printing and the abundance of paper changed that forever. Now, Anyone with access to a press and a bit of ink could become a publisher. Ideas that once took years to copy could now be produced by the hundreds in a single day. Suddenly, literacy mattered more. Control over reading became harder. Scribes lost their monopoly. Information was no longer sacred. It was reproducible. The implications? Immense. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. It was an act of protest, but not, in itself, revolutionary. What made it revolutionary was this. He printed them. Luther's ideas, critical of the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, were printed and spread in pamphlet form, sometimes illustrated, often translated. Within months, his words reached tens of thousands of people. This would not have been possible in a world of parchment. The Reformation wasn't just theological. It was technological. The press and the paper made dissent scalable. Rome couldn't control what was being read in Prague or Zurich or Edinburgh. Paper gave voice to the non-clergy, to the urban poor, to the merchant class, to women, students, radicals. And once that voice was heard, it could not be silenced. In this age of print, personal correspondence also flourished. Letters, once the domain of kings and nobles, became the backbone of diplomacy, business, and private life. Merchants sent contracts across oceans. Philosophers debated across countries. Lovers wrote verses that survived centuries. The epistolary world, a world built through letters, emerged, and it was made possible by paper. Even revolutions were planned in writing. Letters between American colonists, for instance, seeded the ideas that would lead to rebellion. The French Revolution began, in part, through widely circulated pamphlets and petitions, each one printed, copied, or written on paper. We often think revolutions are made with swords, guns, or banners. But what if the true revolution was made with ink and paper? What if the downfall of priestly monopoly, royal absolutism, and feudal control didn't begin in the battlefield, but in printing shops, scribal workshops, and paper mills? What if all it took was for more people to read? Paper tears easily. It wrinkles in rain, burns in seconds, and crumbles with age. And yet, this fragile invention has outlasted marble, steel, and even blood. In this final section, we explore how paper reshaped education, law, science, and identity, and why, in the end, it remains a silent force behind modern civilization. By the 17th century, paper had become ubiquitous. Books were no longer rare heirlooms. They were commodities. Almanacs, medical handbooks, grammar texts, and Bibles were found in homes, shops, and schools. Literacy rates began to rise, slowly but steadily. In Protestant Europe, especially, reading was considered a virtue. After all, if salvation came through understanding Scripture, everyone needed to read. Paper made this possible. And as printing exploded, so did demand for literacy. Towns opened public schools. Merchants taught their children to read and write. Women, previously excluded, began to appear in records as readers, correspondents, and even authors. The pen, once a clerical tool, became personal. A farmer could write to a cousin. A tailor could keep ledgers. A widow could draft a will. And in doing so, they became visible to history. With paper came permanence. Laws were written down and made consistent. Contract became binding documents, not just spoken odes. Property boundaries were mapped and recorded. The modern legal system, with its layers of documentation, evidence, procedure, and appeal, was built on paper. No longer did justice rely on memory, witness, or reputation alone. It relied on the written word. And so, paper began to tame the arbitrary. Kings could be held accountable. Courts could be challenged. A poor man with the right document could defend his rights. It was a subtle shift, but seismic. The scientific revolution could not have happened without paper. Think about it. Experiments must be recorded. Observations must be shared. Theories must be debated across distance and time. Paper enabled the rise of the scientific method. Galileo published findings on planetary motion. Newton outlined laws of motion and gravitation. Darwin drafted pages of naturalist notes during his voyage on the Beagle. Knowledge became cumulative, not because of genius, but because it could now be written down and passed forward. Without paper, science would have remained local, oral, and perishable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, paper had colonized every aspect of life: birth certificates, marriage licenses, passports, tax returns, census forms. You were no longer just you. You were a paper trail. Empires used paper to count their subjects, track their movements, collect their labor, and control their borders. Prisons, schools, hospitals, all ran on paper. The surveillance state didn't begin with computers. It began with the filing cabinet. But it also meant you could be recognized, protected, insured. You could vote. You could sue. Paper gave you an identity, and with it, a kind of power. The professional scribe, once a cornerstone of society, gradually disappeared. By the 19th century, their role was replaced by clerks, secretaries, printers, teachers. But the act of writing didn't vanish. It democratized. In fact, writing became more powerful as it spread. The very idea of public opinion was born in the coffee houses and newspapers of the Enlightenment. Revolutions were stoked not just by swords, but by pamphlets and petitions. And even in silence, even in sleep, paper carried the weight of human thought forward. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a new medium arose: digital text. The screen replaced the page. Email replaced letters. PDFs replaced archives. It may seem that paper is fading, but even digital communication borrows its logic from the world that paper built. We scroll through documents. We write emails. We store files in folders. We use fonts, margins, and page layouts, even when there's no physical page. Paper is still with us, not just in libraries or notebooks, but in the language of the modern world. Consider this. The fall of Rome was recorded on parchment. The rise of Islam was preserved on scrolls. The Reformation spread through paper pamphlets. The Declaration of Independence was a handwritten page. The Holocaust was documented in paper records. The moon landing was logged in binders and punch cards. And even now, in a world of fiber optics and silicon chips, we still sign our names on paper. What does that tell us? Perhaps that the most revolutionary technologies are not always the loudest. They do not always shine or flash. Sometimes they rustle. When you think of old London, your mind may conjure fog, cobblestones, soot-blackened chimneys. But for centuries, the smell that truly defined the city wasn't coal smoke or river mist. It was dung, horse dung, cow dung, pig dung, human waste, kitchen scraps. Manure in all its forms flowed to the capital like blood through veins. And far from being simply a nuisance, dung was business, a valuable, movable, taxable commodity. In this first section, we explore the early centuries of London's relationship with excrement, how it was produced, moved, sold, and fought over in a quietly lucrative, surprisingly organized economy of filth. Let's begin with the obvious. London, for most of its history, ran on horsepower. By the 18th century, estimates suggest over 50,000 horses worked the streets of London each day, pulling carts, wagons, carriages, and cabs. Each horse produced about 30 pounds of manure daily. Do the math, and you find yourself with over 750 tons of dung per day, just from horses. Add to that oxen pulling heavy loads, cows kept for milk in backyards, sheep driven to market, pigs rooting in alleyways, and, of course, human waste. Suddenly, you're looking at a city submerged in filth. But here's the twist. This waste wasn't wasted. Enter the muck collectors, also known as gong farmers, night soil men, and dung merchants. They move through the city at night or in the early morning, armed with carts, shovels, and thick skin. Their job: collect dung from stables, streets, cesspits, and privies, and cart out of the city, but not to dump it, to sell it. Dung was essential to agriculture. Farmers outside the city paid good money for well-rotted manure to fertilize their fields. Human waste, called night soil, was often preferred, richer in nitrogen. Muck collectors made deals with livery stables, public officials, market stallholders, farmers and gardeners on the city's edge. Dung moved from the city's bowels to the countryside's bread baskets. You might think all this was informal, unregulated. Not so. The City of London Corporation, even in the 1300s, had rules about waste. Who could collect it, where it could be dumped, when it had to be removed, fined for letting dung accumulate too long. Gong farmers were licensed. They paid fees. They used designated dumping areas called lay stalls, temporary holding spots before manure was carted further out. Dung had an infrastructure, and like any commodity, it had conflict. Merchants argued over collection rights. Neighbors accused one another of dumping illegally. Entire lawsuits revolved around theft of manure. In one 1682 case, a dung collector was fined for appropriating the produce of another's stables without agreement. Dung, it turns out, had value, and people noticed. Why all this trouble? Because dung meant food. Fields around London were intensively farmed to feed the city's ballooning population. These fields were called market gardens, and they specialized in high-yield crops, vegetables, salad greens, herbs, and fruit. Without fertilizer, these plots would exhaust their nutrients quickly. Dung, particularly mixed dung, combining human and animal waste with straw and ash, was ideal. It heated the soil, added minerals, and helped grow crops in marginal land. Farmers sent money into the city. Dung merchants sent muck out. It was, in a strange way, a closed loop of sustainability, before the word even existed. Of course, not everyone saw dung as profit. For the average Londoner, manure was an unavoidable reality. Streets were unpaved, often muddy and sloped. Dung mixed with rainwater, forming sludge that clung to boots and hems. Children played in it. Dogs rolled in it. Rats nested in it. And in summer it steamed. Contemporary letters and diaries often complain of the smell, but rarely suggest removal as a solution. Instead, the tone is one of grudging acceptance, as if the smell was simply part of urban life, like bells or fog. Samuel Pepys, writing in 1660, described walking through Fleet Street after rain. The stench so foul as to twist my belly, yet the market folk make no complaint. Interestingly, some dung wasn't just spread on fields. Certain types of dry animal dung were used as fuel, especially in poorer districts. Cow and horse dung, when dried, could be burned in small stoves. Human waste? Not so much. In rural areas outside London, cow dung was mixed with straw to make building material, a kind of pre-modern plaster. Walls, floors, even insulation. The scent faded after drying. Dung had many lives. It wasn't waste. It was resource. Before flush toilets, before chemical fertilizers, before garbage trucks and sewer systems. Cities like London had to find ways to survive their own output. Dung wasn't just a byproduct. It was a necessity, a currency, a product with handlers, buyers, and trade routes. And so we ask, if even excrement had value, what else had we learned to throw away? The great dung trade was not a single institution, nor a centralized system. It was a sprawling, decentralized economy rooted in survival, necessity, and opportunity. It was driven by horses, shaped by class, and enforced with law. In this section, we explore how the trade professionalized, how its actors navigated class and stigma, and how the literal infrastructure of excrement shaped the spatial, economic, and environmental fabric of London. The lowest tier in the dung economy was the gong farmer. These men specialized in cleaning cesspits and privies, especially in densely packed urban homes. The term gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go, a euphemism for relieving oneself. Their work was dangerous. Cesspits who released methane gas collapse or cause suffocation. Nocturnal. They were only allowed to work at night due to the smell. Heavily stigmatized. Gong farmers were often socially shunned. Their profession considered unclean in both physical and moral terms. But the irony? They were well paid. In some periods, gong farmers could earn more than skilled craftsmen, because their work was essential and few were willing to do it. Further up the dung ladder were street sweepers and stable boys, who gather horse droppings from roads and courtyards. They form informal teams, often young boys or older men with push carts and shovels. They sold their collections to middlemen or directly to farmers, depending on their connections. Many worked near taverns, coaching inns, markets, livery stables. In busy districts like Smithfield Market or Cheapside, competition could be fierce. Territorial disputes over dung-rich zones were not uncommon, and occasionally ended in fistfights. Then came the muck carters, licensed transporters who removed collected dung from the lay stalls and delivered it to farms outside the city walls. These men needed horses and carts, and permission to operate them, a lay stall license from the city, relationships with farmers and gardeners. Many worked regular routes, transporting not only dung but ashes, kitchen waste, and dead animals as part of broader sanitation service. Some ran family operations, passing down the business for generations, and many supplemented their income by collecting and reselling bones, scrap metal, and cloth rags along the way. A lay stall was a designated plot of land, often within or just outside the city, used to temporarily store dung before it was transported to the countryside. City authorities mandated that lay stalls be located away from major streets. They not overflow into public spaces. Dung not remain more than a few days. These regulations were routinely ignored. Complaints poured in about lay stalls stinking up nearby markets or causing floods during rainstorms. But their necessity was undeniable. Without them, the entire waste removal system broke down. As one 1724 pamphlet put it, the farmer's crop is birthed in the city's gutters. Interestingly, not all dung left the city. In districts like Southwark, Whitechapel, and Lambeth, residents kept chickens, goats, pigs, even cows. These urban microfarms created their own waste, and sometimes purchased dung to enrich kitchen gardens. Some tenement dwellers ran roof gardens or used communal plots fertilized with carted-in manure. So while the countryside depended on urban fill for crops, the city itself was recycling waste to feed its own population. London, it turns out, was a surprisingly organic ecosystem. Dung also had a financial layer. City authorities taxed the dung collectors via licenses, the use of lay stalls via fees, and even the value of dung as an agricultural good. Manure was weighed and priced. Accounts from 18th century ledgers show 3 carts of horse dung at 6d per cart equals 1s. 6d. Load of night soil to Kentish market gardens equals 2s. Dung was legally recognized as property. Theft, tampering, or fraudulent mixing of dung types, i.e., passing off straw-heavy waste as nitrogen-rich manure, could result in fines or jail. Even contracts for dung delivery survived in archives. It was, quite literally, a monetized form of rot. Despite the economic value of the dung trade, its workers were rarely respected. Dung handling was associated with poverty, uncleanliness, criminality, foreigners or lower-class laborers. The upper class depended on dung indirectly, through food, clean streets, and higher crop yields, but they never touched it. And yet, some muck collectors amassed modest wealth. Others lived in slum conditions, near the very waste they transported. A few formed small cooperatives to share costs, horses, and profits. In time, their trade would be pushed aside, not by law, but by sanitation reform. By the early 1800s, reformers, engineers, and inventors were beginning to look at urban waste not as a resource, but as a problem. New ideas were brewing. Ideas of public health, waterborne disease, and moral hygiene. And that raises a question. What happens to an entire economy when cleanliness becomes policy? For centuries, London had lived with dung. Not comfortably, perhaps, but symbiotically. Waste was gathered, traded, sold, and reused. Entire professions revolved around its management. But the 19th century brought a radical new idea. Filth is a threat. Cleanliness is a duty. In this final section, we trace the collapse of the old dung economy under the weight of sanitation reform, scientific discovery, and Victorian values. A transformation that not only changed London, but changed the very meaning of a city. By the early 1800s, London was growing fast, too fast. The population doubled between 1800 and 1850. Housing couldn't keep up. Overcrowding turned tenements into cesspools. Alleyways became rivers of excrement and rotting refuse. The prevailing theory of disease at the time was miasma, the belief that foul air caused illness. This made dung dangerous, not because of germs, which had yet to be discovered, but because of its smell. Authorities now saw ley stalls, cesspits, and dung carts not as necessary evils, but as sources of death. The pressure to remove visible, odorous waste increased. Fast. The turning point came with the Public Health Act of 1848, pushed by reformers like Edwin Chadwick. Chadwick argued that disease spread not just through contagion, but through filth and disorder. His 1842 report, The Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population of Great Britain, shocked Parliament. He wrote, "All smell is disease." This incorrect assumption led to massive change. Cesspits were condemned. Flush toilets were promoted. Night soil collection was phased out. The old dung system, once praised for its agricultural value, was now viewed as dangerous backwardness. In 1858, London suffered the Great Stink, a summer heat wave that baked the Thames into a boiling stew of human and animal waste. The smell was so overpowering, Parliament nearly shut down. This prompted action. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. Between 1859 and 1875, Bazalgette designed and built over 1,300 miles of sewer tunnels beneath London, redirecting waste away from the city and into the Thames estuary. The implications were huge. Privies and cesspits were decommissioned. Night soil men lost their trade. Ley stalls vanished. Dung transport carts became obsolete. The city's filth was no longer recycled. It was flushed. By the 1870s, gong farmers had disappeared. Muck carters were unemployed or repurposed into coal or goods transport. Dung contracts with farmers ended. Those who once profited from waste now found themselves unemployed, forgotten, or forced into new labor roles in the growing industrial economy. Dung, once a commodity, became garbage. Ironically, the countryside suffered. Farmers near London had relied for centuries on city waste as fertilizer, with the sewer system diverting excrement into rivers. This supply was lost. In response, Britain began importing guano, bird droppings from Peru, as a new, potent fertilizer. The guano trade exploded. Ships crossed oceans to replace the fertilizer once carted by hand from London's gutters. In a strange twist, waste was globalized. A local economy of filth was replaced by an imperial one. As the 20th century dawned, the old, chaotic dung economy was gone, replaced by municipal waste management, public health departments, sanitary inspectors, wastewater treatment plants. Cities no longer partnered with nature. They engineered it out. And while this brought undeniable benefits, reduced disease, cleaner streets, longer lifespans, it also severed the ancient relationship between what we produce and how we live. Waste became invisible, removed, forgotten. There was a time when London lived in its own filth, and turned that filth into bread. Before the sewer, before the bin, before modern hygiene, there was a dung man, the cart, the ley stall, the market garden, a closed system, a dirty one, yes, but also a complete one. Now, in a world drowning in landfills and chemical runoff, one might wonder, what did we lose when we stopped seeing waste as value? Imagine you're a medieval peasant. You wake before dawn. The fire's out. The floor is dirt. You've got lice in your hair, a wool tunic that hasn't been washed in months, and a family chamber pot dangerously full in the corner. Now imagine it's laundry day. It's not easy. It's not pretty. And it most definitely doesn't smell like lavender. In this section, we explore how medieval people washed clothes, what they used, who did the labor, and why cleanliness, though rarely achieved, was an essential, often overlooked part of survival. The short answer? Not often. Washing clothes was a physically demanding, time-consuming, and costly task. For the poor, it meant taking time away from work. For the rich, it meant hiring others to do the labor. Clothes were usually washed only when infested with lice or fleas, soil beyond tolerable smell, being passed down, sold, or stored, preparing for church, travel, or childbirth. Most undergarments, like linen shifts and braids, loose underpants, were washed more frequently. Outerwear, like woolen tunics and gowns, was rarely washed, brushed, aired, and beaten, but seldom soaked. A phrase from the 14th century captures the mood. Clean enough to pray, but not to marry. Before modern soap, medieval laundry relied on natural ingredients with chemical properties. Made from wood ash soaked in water, creates an alkaline solution useful for breaking down oils. Harsh on fabric and skin. Used primarily for linens. A type of clay. Absorbs grease. Used for dry cleaning wool garments. Yes, urine. Rich in ammonia, which breaks down fats and brightens fabric. Collected from chamber pots, outhouses, or bought from neighbors. Used widely by fullers, specialists in cloth finishing. To a medieval laundress, a bucket of pee wasn't disgusting. It was essential. Washing required specific tools. Washboard or washing bat, a flat paddle used to beat clothes. Buckets and tubs, for soaking, scrubbing, and wringing. Clotheslines or hedges, for drying garments. Boiling pots, for deep cleaning infested linens. Water was fetched from public wells, rain barrels, rivers, or streams. For the poor, laundry might be done once every few weeks. For the wealthy, their linens were rotated more often, washed by servants or professionals. Laundry wasn't always done at home. In cities, laundresses made a living hauling, washing, and returning clothing, often for inns, clergy, merchants, and noble households. They were usually poor women, often widows or unmarried, paid by the pound of wet laundry, expected to return garments clean, but not damaged, hired for large wash days, like post-battle cleanups or weddings. Their work was backbreaking. In winter, they froze their hands in rivers. In summer, they worked through heat and stink. Soap was rare. Urine and ash were their allies. And yet, their work was vital to public health, even if few acknowledged it. In cities like London, Paris, or Florence, laundresses flocked to rivers. They squatted along banks, kneading garments against rocks, rinsing out lye, or soaking garments in baskets tethered to posts. But rivers weren't clean. They carried waste, blood from butcher shops, dye runoff, and human sewage. And still, they were used because they were free. Some cities tried to regulate. In Paris, the Seine had designated laundry points. In London, washerwomen had to avoid areas near watermills or tanneries. In Florence, laundry days were assigned to avoid conflict. Laundry became a public act, done in full view of others, leading to gossip, disputes, and, occasionally, fines for obscene wringing. One fiber ruled medieval laundry: linen. Why? It could be boiled without shrinking. It absorbed sweat and body oils. It was worn directly on the skin. A noble woman might own 3 shifts, rotating them weekly. A peasant woman? 1, washed only when it began to crawl with lice. Linen, being absorbent, was often layered under wool, meaning outer clothing could go months without a scrub. Medieval people weren't unaware of hygiene. They just managed it differently, through layering, brushing, and ritual soaking. Wearing clean clothes, even if your body was dirty, was a sign of piety, clean linen for church, respectability, readiness for marriage or employment. Some laws even required cleanliness. In certain guilds, apprentices couldn't appear at meeting halls in stained tunics. Yet standards varied. A clean face and brushed garments were often enough to pass as clean, even if lice whispered otherwise beneath the seams. To modern eyes, medieval laundry seems barbaric. But what if that's not fair? What if, despite the filth, people did their best with the resources they had? What does clean really mean when soap is a luxury and urine is a tool? Laundry in the medieval world was not a routine household task. It was a physical ordeal, a day or several. Carve out a calendar, negotiate with the weather, and navigate it with care. Beneath the surface of soap and steam, it was also a window into gender, class, and even disease. In this section, we explore how laundry shaped domestic labor, how people battled parasites and skin infections, and how washing was tangled up with moral judgment, ritual purification, and even violence. In Christian Europe, cleanliness carried a spiritual weight. Though the medieval church did not equate physical filth with sin directly, clean garments, especially linen, were associated with moral discipline, religious purity, readiness to appear before God. Nuns and monks washed their habits more regularly than lay people. Monasteries even had lavatoria, designated areas for washing clothing and bodies. During major feast days or pilgrimages, the faithful would often wash and don clean linen as a sign of devotion. One 13th century English bishop declared, "The soul should not be darker than the shirt wears." This was symbolic, of course, but it also reflected the growing idea that the surface mattered. More than dirt or odor, medieval people feared infestation. Lice, fleas, and body vermin were constant companions. Clothes, especially undergarments, were the front line in that battle. Signs of infestation included uncontrollable itching, small red rashes, known as lousy heat, movement of lice in garment seams, flea bites clustered around warm areas, armpits, groin, waistband. To combat this, people turned to boiling. Boiling clothes didn't just clean, it killed eggs. Linen could survive the temperature. Wool not so much. Some practices included drying clothes on thorn bushes, which were believed to deter lice, dusting garments with ash or sulfur, freezing clothes outdoors in winter to kill parasites, hanging clothes near fire smoke, which repelled insects. Laundry was therefore not just a matter of appearance, but of health, sleep, and sanity. Laundry was considered women's work, but it was more than drudgery. It was a domain of autonomy, community, and sometimes secrecy. Women washed together, shared soap recipes, traded gossip, and looked out for one another. In some towns, riverside laundry days were as much about social life as about hygiene. In cities, public washhouses, known as lavoirs in France, offered shelter, benches, and water access. In London, informal networks of washerwomen created routes between clients and clean clothes. But laundry also involved carrying heavy tubs upstairs, hauling water over long distances, exposure to the cold for hours at a time, handling urine and ash with bare hands. And the risks were real. In winter, laundresses suffered chilblains, frostbite, and pneumonia. In summer, blisters, sunburn, and fatigue. And if a noble's garment was torn or stained, it was a laundress who paid. Most households didn't wash clothing weekly. Instead, they had designated wash weeks, often tied to the agricultural calendar. Typical times included early spring after the muddy thaw, late summer when rivers were lowest, before major holidays, especially Easter and Christmas. During wash weeks, entire families' garments were washed at once. Large tubs were set up outdoors. Fires were built under copper kettles. Lye was prepared several days in advance. Urine might be collected from neighbors or purchased. Clothes were sorted. Linen for boiling, wool for brushing. Some garments were laid flat and beaten with paddles. Others were soaked in running water overnight, staked down with stones. These wash days became communal events in villages. They also served as a kind of reset button. After a harsh season, after illness, after mourning, each region, and often each household, had its own laundry wisdom. In parts of Wales, women used bracken ash for its softness. In Tuscany, water infused with rosemary or laurel was used for final rinses. In northern France, a blend of urine and white wine, yes, really, was used to whiten linens. Laundresses sometimes guarded these methods jealously. They were part of what made their services desirable. Soap, when available, was made from animal fat and lye. Often rough and brown, it was used sparingly, more for stains than for full washes. And despite the harshness of ingredients, laundresses developed intimate skill, knowing exactly how much boiling linen could take before weakening, how long wool could be soaked without felting, how to scrub stains out of undergarments without damaging embroidery. Laundry wasn't always innocent. Records from ecclesiastical courts and city rolls show laundry disputes involving theft of garments, damage to expensive cloth, inappropriate touching or indecency at public wash sites, arguments over river access or soapy runoff. In one 15th century case in York, 2 washerwomen were fined for casting lye upon a neighbor's garden. In another, a noble woman sued her laundress for returning her chemise smelling of fish and rot. Some cases even involved violent altercations. Laundry might have been a chore, but it was also an economy, a livelihood, and a space of tension. It's easy to laugh at medieval laundry, at the urine buckets and the river slogs. But consider this. A single wet wool tunic could weigh 10 to 12 pounds. A full family's wash could weigh over 150 pounds wet. And the washing was just a start. There was wringing, drying, brushing, mending, folding, all done without plumbing, without gloves, without even reliable soap. So when we think of medieval women as passive or idle, perhaps we should ask, how many revolutions were scrubbed into the fabric, then hung to dry on a hedge? By the late Middle Ages, laundry was more than a chore. It was a system, a gendered ritual, a profession, a hazard, a sign of decency, a quiet rebellion against disease, filth, and the disorder of everyday life. In this final section, we explore how laundry practices slowly evolved, how class and morality shaped ideas of cleanliness, and how the legacy of medieval washing days still lingers in language, culture, and our ideas of what it means to be clean. Soap, as we know it, existed in the medieval world, but not widely. It was rough and caustic, made from rendered animal fats and lye, expensive, often sold by apothecaries or merchants, used sparingly, more for hands or spot-cleaning garments than full washes. Most soap came from Marseille and Castile, made with olive oil, milder but still costly. Local craftswomen who made strong, dark laundry soap at home. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that soap became common in household washing, thanks to trade, chemistry advances, and changing standards of cleanliness. But even before that, a slow shift had begun. People started thinking differently about dirt. By the late 1400s, European society was beginning to shift toward moralized hygiene. Cities passed ordinances about smelling clean in public places. Bathing fell out of fashion due to fear of disease, but laundry increased. Manuals on housewifery instructed women to wash monthly or seasonally. Priests and moralists linked tidy garments with chastity and discipline. This wasn't about science. It was about control. As Europe urbanized and stratified, the line between clean and unclean became a line between classes. To be clean was to be respectable. To be dirty was to be suspect. And laundry became evidence, a visible indicator of your worth, your effort, your belonging. Laundry had always been labor. But as towns grew and trade expanded, laundry services became organized businesses. By the 15th century, washerwomen had guilds or informal associations in many cities. Wealthy households outsourced all laundering, from baby linens to noble gowns. Inns, hospitals, and even monasteries contracted laundresses. In some cases, cities assigned public wash spaces and regulated usage. Some laundresses became respected professionals, while others remained marginalized laborers, caught between suspicion and necessity. In Renaissance Florence, washerwomen even wore identifying aprons, part uniform, part social marker. They were known, named, and needed, yet never fully respected. While our story focuses on Europe, it's worth noting that laundry was a universal human labor, with variations but common burdens. In Ming Dynasty China, women washed silks in spring-fed pools, using rice husk ash and pounding stones. In medieval Japan, kimono underlayers were brushed clean and aired in sunlit courtyards. In Islamic Spain, public bathhouses doubled as laundries, with warm water piped through tiled rooms. In West Africa, women washed clothes with soap made from shea nut ash near rivers, singing communal work songs. Wherever people wore cloth, someone had to clean it, and almost always, that someone was a woman. The legacy of medieval laundry still lingers in how we speak and think. Don't air your dirty laundry in public, a phrase that once referred to gossip among washerwomen at riversides. Hung out to dry, once literal, now metaphorical. Washing your hands of it, an act of purification, borrowed from biblical and medieval ritual. The word launder itself comes from the Latin lavare, to wash, which gives us lavatory, lavish, and lotion. Even in crime, we find it money laundering, the act of making the dirty appear clean. By the early modern period, 1600s, 1700s, laundry evolved alongside housing design. Indoor washrooms began to appear in affluent homes. Water was piped in from town cisterns or private wells. Soap was sold in markets, no longer just rendered at home. Ironing became fashionable, another layer of domestic labor. But for the poor, little changed. Rivers, urine, and scrub paddles remained the norm well into the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution would bring washing machines, detergents, and plumbing, but that's a different chapter entirely. For now, the medieval washerwoman remains in history's margins, strong-armed, red-fingered, bent at the waist, scrubbing society clean. Today, we associate cleanliness with science, germs, sterility, crispness. But in the medieval world, it was heavier. It was about labor. It was about ritual. It was about status. It was about survival. When you next throw a shirt into a machine, consider this. Somewhere in your ancestry, someone bent over a frozen riverbank, beating lice out of linen with a paddle, scrubbing away not just dirt, but poverty, shame, and silence. You woke up this morning and trusted your clock. You trusted that today is today, that the calendar matches the sun, that time flows forward at a predictable pace. But for much of European history, this wasn't true. In this section, we travel back to the crumbling Roman Empire, where a once revolutionary calendar began to drift. The consequences? Delayed harvests, misaligned holy days, astronomical errors, and centuries of quiet confusion. This is the story of the Julian calendar, a flawed time-keeping system that ruled Europe for over 1,600 years. Before the calendar, time was local. Villages used natural rhythms, the solstice, the harvest, the rising of stars. Farmers followed the moon. Sailors watched tides and constellations. Priests aligned rituals with sunrise or equinox. But this caused problems for empires. Administration requires dates. Tax collection, religious feasts, military campaigns. All depend on knowing what day it is. And so, around 45 BCE, Julius Caesar introduced a bold new system, the Julian calendar. Working with Alexandrian astronomers, Caesar introduced a solar calendar with 365 days per year, an extra leap day every 4 years, February 29th, 12 months with standardized lengths. This was revolutionary. It replaced the older, confusing Roman lunar calendar, which often required priestly intervention and political manipulation. With the Julian calendar, time became predictable. Seasons aligned with calendar dates. The spring equinox occurred on March 25th, a sacred anchor point. Rome spread this calendar across its empire. It became the standard in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But there was a problem. The Julian system slightly miscalculated the solar year. The actual solar year, the time it takes Earth to orbit the Sun, is approximately 365.2422 days, not 365.25. That's a difference of 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year. Tiny? Yes. But over centuries, that small error added up. By the 8th century, the spring equinox was occurring around March 21st. By the 13th century, it had slipped to March 13th. By the 15th century, the equinox was happening 10 days early. This mattered a lot. Why was this drift such a big deal? Because of Easter. The date of Easter was calculated based on the spring equinox, the first full moon after it, the following Sunday. This method, formalized by the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, was meant to unify Christianity. All believers would celebrate resurrection on the same day. But as the equinox slipped backward, Easter drifted too. Feasts occurred at the wrong times. Fasting seasons shortened or lengthened. Pilgrimage schedules were thrown off. Agricultural feasts tied to planting misaligned with the seasons. And since religious calendars anchor political and economic life, the confusion rippled through everything. By the 14th and 15th centuries, different regions celebrated Easter on different days. Monasteries argued over feast calendars. Farmers protested unfair tithes due to mismatched harvest dates. Astronomers warned that eclipses and planetary movements were being mispredicted. Even the Catholic Church began to panic. A French bishop in 1370 wrote, If the heavens remain constant and the church does not, who is truly out of order? It was a theological crisis, a bureaucratic nightmare, and an astronomical embarrassment. Time was broken, and no one agreed how to fix it. By the 15th century, scholars and astronomers across Europe knew the Julian calendar was flawed. Regiomontanus, a German astronomer, noted the equinox drift and proposed corrections. Nicholas of Cusa called for calendar reform at the Council of Basel in 1435. Universities like Paris and Salamanca held debates on calendar theory. But reforms required consensus, and consensus required authority, something medieval Europe sorely lacked. No king, bishop, or emperor wanted to be the one to change time itself. And so as war, plague, and reform rocked the continent, the calendar ticked on, quietly wrong. Imagine planting your crops on March 25th, thinking spring has arrived, only to watch them freeze. Imagine fasting for Lent, only to discover you broke it early because the stars said otherwise. Imagine being a monk tasked with charting Easter, when your equinox is 10 days too early. And now imagine this. Time feels stable, but it isn't. So ask yourself, what happens when a civilization builds itself on a calendar it doesn't understand? By the late 1500s, the Julian calendar was out of sync with the actual solar year by nearly 11 days. The spring equinox, once fixed at March 25th, was now landing on March 14th. That might sound trivial, but for the church, it was intolerable. Because Easter was tied to the equinox, the date of Christianity's most sacred festival was now calculated wrong. In this section, we explore the monumental attempt to correct the mistake. It took a pope, a team of Jesuits, a secret math consultant, and a leap of political will to do what no one had done in 1,600 years: fix time itself. By the 1570s, Pope Gregory XIII, head of the Catholic Church, was facing a crisis of calendar credibility. For decades, astronomers and theologians had urged reform. Now, with Protestantism splitting Europe and scientific ideas gaining traction, time was slipping dangerously out of the Church's control. So in 1579, he commissioned a reform committee. Their goal? Restore the spring equinox to March 21st. Reform the leap year system. Ensure accurate Easter calculations. Minimize disruption to civil and liturgical life. It would be the most significant correction to the Western calendar since Julius Caesar. Gregory's team included Christoph Clavius, a Jesuit scholar, astronomer, and mathematician, trained in both classical texts and modern astronomical tools. Aloysius Lilius, a physician and calendar theorist from Naples, whose proposed reforms formed the backbone of the solution. Together, they devised a plan that was astronomically precise, logically elegant, and most importantly, politically possible. Lilius's work was posthumously published as Compendium Novi Rationis Restituendi Calendarium, a dry title for what was effectively a blueprint for rewriting time. Here's what they proposed. To restore the equinox to its intended position, they proposed that October 4th, 1582 be followed by October 15th, 1582. 10 days would vanish from history, never be lived. Under the Julian system, every fourth year was a leap year. Gregory's team introduced a refinement. A year is a leap year if divisible by 4, except for years divisible by 100, unless they are also divisible by 400. This meant 1600 would be a leap year, but 1700, 1800, and 1900 would not. This tiny adjustment reduced the calendar's drift to just 26 seconds per year, a correction so precise it would take over 3,000 years to accumulate a full day of error. The equinox was fixed at March 21st. Tables for determining Easter were updated based on new moon cycles and epochs, lunar age on January 1st. It was a mathematical masterpiece, cloaked in religious robes. On October 4th, 1582, the final Julian day was printed on papal calendars. The next day, October 15th, 1582, 10 days disappeared. People went to bed on a Thursday and woke up on a Friday. 11 days later, no one died. Nothing exploded. But the psychological shock was real. Diarists wrote about lost days. Peasants protested that rent was being collected for days that never happened. Some believe it was a trick by landlords or tax collectors, but the church insisted it was for the greater good, and the modern Gregorian calendar was born. Not everyone agreed. Protestant Europe, deeply suspicious of Rome, rejected the Gregorian reform outright. England refused to adopt it. German states split. Some adopted, others didn't. Scandinavian countries hesitated for decades. They saw it as a papal plot, a religious intrusion into daily life. As a result, for over 150 years, Europe lived under two competing calendars. Catholic countries used the Gregorian calendar. Protestant and Orthodox countries stuck with Julian time. This caused chaos in diplomacy. Letters between monarchs used different dates. Trade. Shipping records didn't match. War. Some battles have two recorded dates, one for each calendar. Imagine planning a treaty when your Thursday is their Monday. To cope, people began using double dating. For example, a document might be signed March 2nd, 1692-93, or October 10th, Old Style, / October 20th, New Style. This confusion lasted for centuries. Even Shakespeare and Cervantes, who died in April 1616, did not die on the same day, despite sharing a death date, because England still used a Julian calendar. When Gregory XIII changed the calendar, he wasn't just fixing a math problem. He was reasserting religious authority, aligning human rhythm with celestial motion, redefining how Europe marked the seasons, the feasts, and itself. But when 10 days vanish from history, what is lost? A birth? A harvest? A crime? A kiss? Can a civilization rewrite its calendar and still be the same civilization? The Gregorian reform had been declared. 10 days had vanished. Leap years had been redefined, but the world didn't change all at once. In this final section, we explore the long, slow adoption of the new calendar, the strange contradictions it created across borders and centuries, and the quiet miracle of consensus that now lets nearly all of humanity agree, at last, on what day it is. England and its colonies refused to adopt the Gregorian calendar for nearly 170 years after its introduction in 1582. Why? Deep mistrust of the Pope and all things Catholic. Fear of losing control over religious observances. A Protestant conviction that Rome should not control time. As a result, England and its empire continued to use the Julian calendar, even as the date drift widened. By 1752, the difference between the Julian and Gregorian calendars was 11 days. Finally, under pressure from trade partners and astronomers, Parliament passed a calendar New Style, Act of 1750. It decreed, September 2nd, 1752 will be followed by September 14th, 1752. The start of the new year would change from March 25th to January 1st. Yes, prior to that, the English New Year began on March 25th, known as Lady Day. This meant that for a time, March 24th, 1743 was followed by March 25th, 1744. The result? Centuries of confusing legal records. Popular legend holds that English people rioted when the calendar changed, shouting, "Give us back our 11 days." While the reality of riots is debated, resentment was real. Rent and wages were affected. Birthdays and feast days disappeared. Debtors gained 11 days of reprieve, or lost them, depending on interpretation. In rural areas, some communities refused to accept the change for decades. They continued celebrating festivals like Plough Monday, Michaelmas, and even Christmas on their old dates. The calendar was official, but folk time lingered. While Protestant Europe eventually adopted the Gregorian calendar, Germany by 1700, Britain by 1752, Sweden fully by 1753, Orthodox countries resisted even longer. Russia didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1918, after the Bolshevik Revolution. Greece waited until 1923. The Eastern Orthodox Church, to this day, still uses a Julian calendar for liturgical purposes. This means that Orthodox Christmas is celebrated on January 7th, which is December 25th in the Julian calendar. Some Orthodox Easters still differ from Western Easter by weeks. The Gregorian reform unified much of the West, but time remained fractured. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European empires expanded, they brought their calendars with them. British colonies adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752 alongside England. Catholic colonies in the Americas and Asia had used it since 1582. The spread of railroads, telegraphs, and imperial administration forced calendars to standardize. By the time the International Meridian Conference met in 1884 to establish the prime meridian at Greenwich, the Gregorian calendar was globally dominant. But now a new problem had emerged. Local time versus global time. The rise of time zones and eventually a coordinated universal time, UTC, meant humanity wasn't just agreeing on dates, but on minutes, seconds, and atomic oscillations. We had moved from sundials to mechanized consensus. Even though we all now share the Gregorian calendar, our emotional calendars still differ. Chinese New Year shifts yearly. Ramadan is determined by the lunar calendar. Jewish holidays follow the Hebrew calendar. Ethiopian Christians still use a version of the Alexandrian calendar. Calendars are cultural memory devices, layers of timekeeping that preserve identity, history, and ritual. And so, even in the age of satellites and sync clocks, old time survives, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. The Gregorian calendar is very good, but not perfect. It gains about one day every 3,000 years. It is not aligned with lunar months. Our months vary from 28 to 31 days, and none match the moon cycle. Weeks do not align neatly with months or years. Every few decades, someone proposes a rational calendar with equal-length months, 13 months of 28 days, or no leap years. None have succeeded. Because calendars are not just math. They're habit, culture, and consensus. You can't just change time. You have to bring everyone with you. The Julian calendar was off by 11 minutes a year. That tiny miscalculation nearly fractured Europe, religiously, politically, and intellectually. And yet, we live with it for 1,600 years. So we might ask, what else in our modern world is good enough, but quietly drifting off course? We assume time is fixed, neutral, scientific. But history shows time is something we agree on. And sometimes we get it wrong. Salt, you sprinkle it without thinking. A dash here, a pinch there. But there was a time, long before refrigeration, supermarkets, or factory farms, when salt was not just a seasoning. It was survival. In this section, we explore why salt was the economic engine, political powder keg, and strategic obsession of medieval and early modern Europe. From food preservation to taxation, salt became the quiet cause of revolts, monopolies, and entire city-states. This isn't a story about flavor. It's a story about power. Salt had been called the only rock we eat. And for much of history, it was as valuable as gold. Why? Because it allowed food to last. Salt draws out moisture and kills bacteria. It preserves meat, fish, and vegetables. In pre-refrigeration economies, it turned perishable goods into stored wealth. A salted ham could feed a family through winter. A salted cod could travel across the Atlantic. Salt was the difference between hunger and security. In agrarian societies, surplus food is wealth, and salt unlocked that surplus. Salt wasn't just for food. It was used in medicine to clean wounds and balance humors. It was mixed with vinegar as an early disinfectant. It appeared in religious rites, sprinkled on altars, used in baptisms, sealed into contracts. In Catholic Europe, salt symbolized purity and incorruptibility. To be worth one's salt was to be worth your wage. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rations, giving us the word salary. This was no luxury. Salt was infrastructure. Medieval salt came from three primary sources. Seawater was trapped in shallow basins and left to evaporate, common along warm coastlines, France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, dependent on climate and labor. Extracted from underground deposits, common in Central Europe, especially Salzburg, Lüneburg, and Wieliczka in Poland. Dangerous and expensive to mine. Salty water was boiled down to extract crystals. Required fuel, usually wood, making it resource-intensive. Salt production was regional, seasonal, and environmentally demanding. Whoever controlled salt sources controlled trade, and often the state. Many of Europe's great cities were built on salt. Salzburg, literally salt castle, and Austria became rich from alpine salt mines. Lüneburg in Germany exported salt along the Elbe to Scandinavia and the Baltic. Venice rose to power through control of Adriatic salt works. Salt didn't just enrich, it strategically aligned. Cities formed alliances, created salt leagues, and built canals to bypass rival toll roads. Salt shaped infrastructure, roads, bridges, warehouses, and ports. One Venetian diplomat wrote in 1310, "He who holds the salt holds the throat of trade." Governments quickly realized salt was too important to leave untaxed. Enter the gabelle. In medieval France, the gabelle was a mandatory tax on salt. But it wasn't just a tax, it was a state monopoly. Citizens were required to buy a fixed amount of salt each year at inflated prices from government stores. The results? Smuggling exploded. Black markets thrived. Commoners resented the elite exemption. In some regions, failing to buy your salt quota was a punishable offense. By the 17th century, the gabelle provided nearly 10% of France's total revenue, but also fueled deep unrest. It would become one of the key grievances leading to the French Revolution. Salt taxes created a new class of criminal, the salt smuggler. In France, they were called fauxonneurs. They hiked mountains with sacks of contraband, hid salt in bread, hay, and even clothing. Organized smuggling rings that rivaled organized crime. Entire border towns became known for salt smuggling. In some cases, local officials turned a blind eye or joined in. Punishments were harsh. Fines, imprisonment, branding. For repeat offenders, execution. And yet the trade continued. Because salt wasn't a luxury, it was life. Salt is humble, tasteless on its own, often invisible in food. But when a government makes it scarce or expensive, it becomes revolutionary. So ask yourself, what happens when something essential, common, and universal becomes a tool of power? What else in our world fits that description today? Salt might seem like a passive commodity, quiet, crystalline, and inert. But in early modern Europe, salt was often a trigger. It could provoke military action, popular uprising, or economic blockade. In this section, we trace the salt monopolies that gave birth to war, the revolts they inspired, and the extraordinary lengths people went to avoid paying for privilege of salting their food. This is salt as strategy, scandal, and subversion. The Republic of Venice built much of its early wealth not on spices from the east, but on salt from the Adriatic. By the 13th century, Venice had taken control of salt works in Chioggia, Comacchio, and parts of Dalmatia. The Venetian state declared a total monopoly. All salt imported, produced, or traded within Venetian territory had to pass through state hands. Private salt production was banned. This control served two purposes. Revenue. Salt was taxed, stored, and resold by the state. Leverage. Venice could offer or deny salt to allies and rivals. When cities like Ravenna or Ferrara challenged Venetian dominance, Venice blockaded their salt imports, cutting off their ability to preserve food or feed armies. This wasn't just economics. It was political warfare through crystals. Perhaps the most literal example came in 1482, when Pope Sixtus IV imposed a new salt tax on the Papal States, particularly targeting Ferrara, a northern Italian duchy ruled by the Des family. Duke Ercole I of Ferrara refused to pay. Rome responded with excommunication and military action. The result? The Salt War of 1482 to 1484, fought between Ferrara, backed by Venice, and papal forces, backed by Naples and Milan. Though the war was brief, it exposed how quickly a commodity tax could escalate into armed conflict. Ferrara's refusal wasn't just economic. It was a challenge to papal sovereignty. Salt had become sacramental politics. France's salt tax, the gabelle, was both reviled and rigidly enforced. By the 17th century, the country was divided into multiple salt zones. Pays the Grande Gabelle, highest prices, strict enforcement. Pays the Petite Gabelle, moderate rates. Pays exempt, no salt tax at all. These zones created absurd and dangerous incentives. People smuggled salt across internal borders within the same country, risking prison or death. In southwest France, a popular uprising erupted in 1548, when the monarchy attempted to extend the gabelle into regions that had previously been exempt. Peasants, artisans, and even local nobles revolted. Salt warehouses were looted. Tax collectors were stoned. Government records were burned. The response? The revolt was crushed militarily. Hundreds were executed. The region was placed under direct royal control. But the resentment lingered, and the salt tax remained a symbol of oppression. Interestingly, many salt smugglers were women. In parts of France and Italy, women carried small bags of illegal salt beneath skirts or in corsets. Distracted border guards served as couriers between smugglers and buyers. Their role was both economic and subversive. A 17th century French magistrate wrote, "The peasant's wife is more dangerous than the bandit's knife, for she carries the state's undoing beneath her petticoats." This wasn't hyperbole. In some years, illegal salt trade exceeded legal sales. Salt was no longer just a commodity. It had become a currency of defiance. Though our focus is European, we must briefly jump forward in time to one of history's most famous acts of salt protest, the Salt March of 1930, led by Mohandas Gandhi. The British colonial government in India had imposed a monopoly on salt production and sales, banning Indians from collecting their own, even from natural seawater. Gandhi walked 240 miles to the sea, picked up a handful of salt, and broke the law. This act, simple, quiet, symbolic, sparked mass civil disobedience across India. And it was a reminder, salt, humble as it seems, can represent freedom when it's taken away. You can live without gold. You can live without sugar. But you can't live long without salt. So when salt becomes a tool of power, controlled, taxed, and withheld, it's more than economic. It's existential. So ask yourself, what happens when governments forget that some things, like air, water, and salt, shouldn't belong to anyone at all? By the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of salt as a revolutionary force was drawing to a close. But its legacy remained, etched into cities, languages, laws, and even the infrastructure beneath our feet. In this final section, we explore how salt left behind a geography of control, how it evolved into industry and identity, and how the world quietly transitioned from fighting over salt to taking it completely for granted. Salt left visible fingerprints across the European landscape. Salzburg, Austria, Salt Castle, built on alpine mining wealth. Salers-de-Baron, France, known for its natural brine springs and salt trade. Salina, Salin, towns across Europe named for salt production. Halle, Germany, ancient salt town. The Hall in its name relates to salt. Hall in Celtic. Trade routes evolved around salt transport. The Old Salt Road in Germany connected Lüneburg's salt mines to Lübeck's port. Via Salaria in Italy linked Rome to Adriatic salt works. In England, saltways were ancient tracks connecting Droitwich and other salt-producing towns to inland markets. These roads often predated modern borders. Salt dictated where towns rose, how empires taxed, and who starved or thrived. With the Industrial Revolution, salt production changed. Mechanical pumps replaced buckets in brine extraction. Coal-fired evaporators made boiling faster and more efficient. Salt was used in textile dyeing, soap making, glass production, and metal processing. It was no longer just a food preservative. It became a chemical building block. And yet, governments still taxed it. In France, the gabelle persisted until French Revolution, 1790. Napoleon briefly reinstated it. Only in 1945, after World War II, was France's salt tax finally abolished. In Britain, salt taxes lasted until 1825. In India, the British salt monopoly lasted until Gandhi broke it in 1930. Salt was no longer fought over on battlefields. Now it was debated in parliaments and courts. In the modern world, salt is so cheap it's almost free. Table salt costs pennies per pound. Road salt is spread by the ton on icy highways. Nations stockpile it not for war, but for weather. And yet, we still manage salt like a strategic resource. In many countries, iodine is added to salt to prevent goiters and thyroid problems, making it a tool of public health. In cold climates, salt budgets determine how well cities respond to snow. In coastal regions, seawater desalination, removing salt, becomes a national security issue. Salt never left. It just changed form. Even after its political potency faded, salt retained symbolic power. In Catholic rites, salt is used in blessings and baptisms. In Jewish tradition, salt accompanies bread on the Sabbath. In Islamic culture, sharing salt can signify trust and protection. In Japanese Shinto, salt is used to purify spaces and ward off evil. In many cultures, spilling salt is a bad omen, to be counteracted by tossing a pinch over one's shoulder. We carry salt in our language. Worth your salt, valuable and reliable. Salty, sharp-tongued, emotional. Salacious, from sal, the Latin root, tying passion flavor. Salt moved from trade routes to metaphor, from infrastructure to idiom. It's easy to forget. Salt is not optional. Every cell in your body uses salt to regulate water balance. Your nerves need sodium to conduct electrical signals. Muscles, especially your heart, depend on proper salt levels. Too much can be dangerous, but too little is fatal. And so, the wars fought over salt were not just about commerce. They were about life itself. The average adult human has about 250 grams of salt in their body, roughly 1 cup. Lose it and you die. In a very real way, you are made of the thing they once fought over. Salt once built empires. It carved cities into stone. It drove revolutions. It paid armies. It nourished the poor. It provoked laws, smuggling, and war. And now, it costs pennies. The only reason you don't fight over today is because someone, centuries ago, did. So the next time you reach for a salt shaker, ask yourself, what else in your life was once so precious? It was worth dying for? It might surprise you to learn that some of Europe's finest beer was developed not in taverns or breweries, but in monasteries. In a world where water could kill and hygiene was inconsistent at best, monks perfected the brewing of ale as both a necessity and a spiritual act. This section explores how beer became entwined with monastic life, how brewing evolved under vows of silence and poverty, and why fermentation, both biological and spiritual, was central to survival in the medieval world. Let's begin with the basic fact. In much of medieval Europe, water was not safe. Contaminated wells, river waste, and animal runoff made drinking water a gamble. Beer, mildly alcoholic and boiled during production, was not just safer, it was essential. Monasteries brewed beer for daily consumption by monks, pilgrims and guests in the monastery goose houses. The poor, many abbeys gave out free beer as charity. Commercial sale eventually, and they weren't just brewing any beer. They were developing some of the most consistent, high-quality recipes in Europe, centuries before industrial brewing. Much of monastic life in medieval Europe was shaped by the rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th-century guide to monastic discipline. Key principles included silence, prayer, manual labor, hospitality, self-sufficiency. Brewing checked many of these boxes. It required quiet, careful work. It was both labor and service. It supported the community. It aligned with the Benedictine belief that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and beer, especially low-alcohol small beer, could be consumed without violating asceticism. It was considered part of a monk's daily sustenance, not a luxury. Medieval brewing was as much art as science. Monks refined techniques that would later become standard in European brewing. Barley or other grains were soaked, germinated, and dried. This converted starches to fermentable sugars. The malt was mixed with hot water to extract sugars. The result, a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was boiled, often with herbs or spices, before hops became standard. This step sterilized the liquid, making it safer than water. Yeast, often wild or from previous batches, was introduced. The mixture fermented in large wooden vats. Beer was stored in barrels. Some monasteries served it directly from cool cellars. Each batch varied, but monasteries developed reputation and consistency. Their brewing logs, some of which survive, recorded weather, grain quality, fermentation time, and seasonal variations. Some monastic orders, especially Trappists, took vows of silence. That meant brewing was often done wordlessly, using gestures, bells, and established routines. A monk might Ring a bell to signal wort boiling. Tap a barrel 3 times for fermentation start. Bow silently to acknowledge a task completed. Brewing became a form of discipline, a sacred rhythm. The process was meditative, built on repetition and attention to detail. In a world of chaos outside monastery walls, plague, famine, war, beer inside the abbey became a symbol of stability. Monastic beer was not just hydration. It was also considered medicinal. Physicians of the time believed beer warmed the body, helped with digestion, prevented humoral imbalances, could be flavored with herbs to treat specific conditions. Some monks infused beers with wormwood for parasites, heather for inflammation, sage and rosemary for circulation. While these claims seem odd today, many herbs do have antimicrobial or medicinal properties. And in a time when wine was expensive and clean water rare, beer was an accessible daily health tool. Monasteries were obligated to offer hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and visiting clergy were given food, lodging, and, importantly, beer. Records from English monasteries show that guests were given 1 to 2 gallons per day, depending on class and weather. In some Benedictine houses, each monk received up to 5 liters of beer daily, divided into mealtime portions of small beer very low in alcohol. Children drank it. The sick drank it. Even the elderly and clergy. Beer was not inebriation, it was nutrition. To the monks, brewing wasn't separate from spiritual life. It was a task done with care, in silence, for the good of others, according to a rhythm that mirrored the divine order of creation. So perhaps we should ask, what happens when the pursuit of holiness and the act of fermentation become the same thing? In the last section, we saw how monastic brewing began as a matter of necessity, ritual, and charity. But over time, something changed. As demand grew and fame spread, monasteries became not just holy places, but brewing institutions. Their beer traveled further, their recipes standardized, and their cellars swelled not just with barrels, but with wealth. In this section, we explore how beer turned from sacrament to surplus, and how monks balanced their vows of poverty with the profits of a thirsty world. Medieval monasteries were scientific hubs. Long before the term existed, they had libraries to record processes, scribes to copy recipes, timekeeping tools to monitor fermentation, cool cellars ideal for storing barrels. Monks tracked brewing conditions with care. Was the barley dry this season? How long did the mash rest? How did fermentation change with moon phases or temperature? What began as a survival skill became a precision craft. Some monasteries even developed different beers for different audiences. Low-alcohol table beer for daily monk consumption. Stronger brews for guests or feast days. Specialty spice beers for festivals. Brewing was becoming professionalized, and monks were leading the way. As monastic beer gained fame, demand soared. By the 12th and 13th centuries, nobles ordered beer from distant abbeys. Merchants struck contracts to distribute barrels. Cities allowed monks to sell beer in markets and fairs. But the rule of St. Benedict was clear. Monks must remain poor in spirit and deed. So, how did they justify the growing beer economy? Through careful framing. Beer sales funded charity and hospital work. Income supported abbey repairs and scriptoria. Monks argued that since labor was holy, selling the fruits of labor was permitted, so long as profits weren't hoarded personally. In practice, some monasteries grew enormously wealthy, especially in beer-rich regions like Flanders, Bavaria, and Normandy. As demand outpaced monk labor, abbeys began hiring lay brothers, men who lived under monastic discipline but were not ordained, as well as secular workers. Tasks were divided. Monks oversaw recipe and ritual. Laymen handled malting, mashing, hauling, and selling. Women, especially in associated convents, sometimes helped with cleaning barrels or preparing herbs. In larger monasteries, brewing became a department, with brewmasters, cellar keepers, and record clerks. This development mirrored broader medieval trends, where skilled labor, guild structures, and specialization increased. And the monks? They kept brewing, quietly. By the early modern period, 1500s, 1600s, monastic brewing had evolved into distinct traditions, especially among Cistercians and Trappists. These orders focused on simplicity, silence, and self-sufficiency. But their beer was anything but simple. They produced dark, rich Alesh with high alcohol content. Beers aged longer and fermented multiple times. Beers brewed in winter and stored in stone cellars. These brews were hearty, high in calories, and ideal for fasting seasons, when solid food was forbidden. Beer was, in a very real sense, liquid bread. Even today, Trappist beers, like Chimay, Wesseltern, and Orville, continue this tradition, brewed under monastic supervision, with profit-supporting charity. Recognizing the quality and stability of monastic beer, local rulers often protected monasteries with special privileges, exclusive brewing rights within certain regions, exemptions from beer taxes, priority access to grain and firewood. Monasteries became islands of beer security in a feudal world. During wars or famines, rulers were more likely to guard monastery breweries than secular ones, not out of piety, but because monks produced clean, reliable drink for soldiers, pilgrims, and hospitals. In times of plague, monastic beer boiled and stored was often safer than well water. By the 17th century, monastic brewing faced new pressures. Commercial breweries emerged in towns and cities. Secular guilds pushed back against religious brewing privileges. Religious wars, especially the Reformation, led to the destruction of many abbeys. In Protestant regions, many monasteries were dissolved, taking centuries of brewing knowledge with them. But in Catholic strongholds, the brewing continued, now more deliberately tied to brand, tradition, and craft. Monastic beer was no longer just for survival. It was a product of heritage and, for many, a holy drink.